The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 6. Joseph's Difficulties. At first the path was easy enough. Then Seven noticed that it gradually became slippery, and the clear air seemed colder. Suddenly, in fact, the wind was so chilly that OverSoul 7 changed his artist's robe to a woolen one and added a scarf. "Aren't you cold, Lydia?" he called, but there was no answer. Squinting, Seven realized that a fine snow was blowing before his eyes, and for a moment he couldn't see anything at all. "Lydia!" he called again, when he thought he saw her ahead in the distance. But where had the snow come from? In the next instant, with a sinking heart, he knew. For the figure ahead wasn't Lydia. It was one of his other personalities, Joseph, Lydia's father-to-be. Seven had been so involved with Lydia's experiences that he'd almost forgotten Joseph entirely. Well, not really. That was an exaggeration, he told himself quickly, guiltily. Yet he was rather impatient at being called away from Lydia, and it didn't help when Seven remembered his last encounter with Joseph, who had angrily told Seven to mind his own business and leave him alone. Seven had to claim these rather uncharitable thoughts about Joseph as his own. But, as he told Cypress later, that was before he realized Joseph's plight. For almost instantly he sensed the desolation of Joseph's spirit. Even before he saw Joseph's body half frozen, huddled up on the mountain, with the vodka bottle which had rolled halfway down the first slippery hill. It would be difficult to find a more dismal scene. In a flash, OverSoul 7 took it all in. The events involved with Joseph's life collected, swirled, flew into Seven's immediate experience, colliding, appearing, and disappearing, until finally they fell into their proper time-space relationships, and Seven could focus clearly in the present, according to Joseph's experience. In the farmhouse hardly visible down the 17th century hills, for example, Joseph's wife, Bianca, was approaching labor. Through Joseph's dimmed mental vision, Seven saw the scene. Joseph had rushed through the house in a frenzy of agony and concern that he was unable to voice. The 4 fireplaces were all blazing so that the house would be warm for the coming birth. But, because Joseph hadn't cleaned out the fumes properly, it was overheated, filled the fireplace smoke and steam from water boiling in the pots. Joseph kept yelling that the steam would ruin his canvases, sitting there unused for months actually, gathering dust, because he hadn't been able to paint decently for what seemed like ages. But the smell of his turpentine rags had mixed with the smoke and steam and made him ill. The women were all yelling, Bianca most of all, screaming in bed, so bloated he thought she'd burst, and his mother-in-law chased him out into the barn. The sudden icy air made him dizzy. He glared back at the house with loathing and love, all twisted together. grabbed his vodka bottle from where he'd hidden it underneath the hay, and jammed his skis on his feet. The first slopes had been easy. He sang to lift his spirits and pretended that he was 20 and unmarried, a roaming, frolicsome artist instead of 26 and domesticated. He skied fast and drank faster, not noticing or pretending not to notice that darkness was falling, and trying to forget Bianca's staring eyes, determined to run from the pleading screams that terrified him for reasons he couldn't explain. If that was birth, well, damn the gods, if there were any. No wonder Christ wasn't a father. The thought scared him. It was sacrilegious. No mention of Christ having a penis. Oh God, he moaned, blearily and horrified. Now where had that thought come from? Thinking frightened him to begin with. To forget his thoughts, he tried to plan a painting in his mind. Just then he fell down, twisted his leg, lost one ski, and realized that most of the feeling in both legs had vanished about the same time. How far from the house was he? His clothes were warm enough for working outside for an hour or so, but he'd been out for longer than that, he thought. Or had he? His time sense was all jumbled. How long ago was it that he'd been thrown out of his own house for unceremoniously... Well, they'd be sorry. His emotions overspilled. He sat up, leaning against a tree, staring down the mountainside. The icy twilight was already descending. Bleak, barren hills were snow-crusted, and the air was sharp. He knew that he had no time to waste. He had to get going, claim his other ski, and start back, going faster than he'd come. He had to restore his circulation. Yet, perversely, he sat there, grumbling to himself. Birth had no right to be so beastly, he thought. He couldn't bear to think what Bianca must be going through. How could their jolly love-making lead to such terror, dear God? And what use was it to pray? What did God know about terror? He himself had no use for Christendom, nor did it have any use for him, which was all right. But now he wanted some kind of comfort, some reassurance, that birth wouldn't be as awful for Bianca as he, and everybody else, thought it would be. If there was a God, if there were gods, but they were all children's tales, he thought. A lot of good Bianca's Christ was now. He imagined, just as he lost consciousness, that some ancient Nordic gods shared the hills with him. They would wake him up, welcome him with gigantic feasts and resplendent sword fights, boisterous male laughter, offering him slabs of charred sweet meat, pigs stolen from his neighbors, gods that were eternal and male and didn't need fleshy soft women's bodies, gods that had no need to give bloody birth, ancient Viking gods banqueting through the long winter night. Don't you ever think of anything besides food? Oversoul 7 said, rather peevishly. Joseph had definitely broadened girth-wise since he'd last looked at him closely. Joseph opened his mental eyes. His physical ones were nearly frosted shut. 7 took the shape of an old wise man. "You've very nearly done it this time," he said. "Oh, it's you," Joseph moaned, then said pathetically, "You've got to get me out of this. I'm half frozen. I'll never make it home." "I hope you thoroughly realize the serious predicament you've gotten yourself into," 7 said sternly, looking ancient as the hills, wise and dependable, and somewhat angry. "This isn't any time for a sermon," Joseph said mentally. "I don't even know if I'm really seeing you or not, but whenever I do see you, then I'm either dreaming or delirious." "You're always delirious," 7 answered. "Here." He hallucinated a bottle of brandy. Joseph sat up in his spirit body, unknowingly in this case, and drank sputteringly as he did, while 7 made a quick mental trip to Joseph's house to see what was going on there now. A steam bath. The boiling water steamed up the windows and froze into a glittering glaze in which the candlelight danced. The chimney smoke made a low dark ceiling so that members of the family went scudding beneath it, bent over, coughing and sputtering. Bianca was in the master bedroom on the second floor. She looked like a terrified, big, blonde-haired doll. Her hair, braided for the birth, was wet with perspiration and steam. Her light blue eyes vacant one moment and scared to death the next. Her mother, Miss Hosentoff, kept yelling, "It's almost time," to 3 female cousins who kept moaning for no good reason that 7 could discover. A huge half-finished painting stood on a heavy wooden easel by the hall window. With the rags hanging there stank of turpentine that Joseph cleaned the brushes in daily so that Bianca would think he'd been busy painting. All the other rags and pieces of cloth were piled in the bedroom, preparatory to the birth. 7, invisible, kicked these aside and went over to Bianca. He'd seen more births than he could remember, and he knew at once that Bianca's pains right now were caused by fear and foreboding. She was close, though, he saw, with some very definite feelings of disquietude, and he'd have to accelerate time considerably for Lydia, because when the baby was due, well, Lydia had to be there. Yet he tried to forget his concern about the future birth, so he could concentrate on Bianca's present. She never saw him. Shaking his head, half vexed, with her and Joseph and Lydia as well, 7 said mentally, "Bianca, you aren't due yet. Your pains are caused by fear. Breathe deeply. Let yourself go. There now. There's nothing to it. That's right." He sent ripples of energy to her belly, watched them travel to her uterus and down her thighs. Bianca began to doze. Seven patted her stomach good-naturedly, and when she began to quiet down, he went downstairs. The men, Elgren Hosenhoff and his brothers, were in the barns along with sawdust and hay, animal breath and manure, and Seven saw vodka. The four men were huddled together, squatting and laughing, in one of the cows' stalls, warm and cozy, with pitchforks ready in case one of the women came to fetch them, in which case they would say they've been working all the time. Joseph's near frozen and needs your help. He took his favorite ski trail up the mountain. Seven said these words to Elgren, Joseph's father-in-law, and at the same time he implanted in Elgren's mind the most pathetic picture of Joseph's predicament. Elgren suddenly swore. His fat stomach rumbled. He leaped to his feet. "I just had the awful thought that Joseph's taken off somewhere," he squalled. "Where is he, my dumb son-in-law?" Seeing the commotion safely started, watching the men check for Joseph unsuccessfully, and then indignantly saddling the horses for rescue, leaving the warmth of the barns for the winter night, Seven returned to Joseph. Or rather, he returned to the part of him that he'd sent to the house for his mission. To Joseph, Seven had been with him all the while. Seven, however, was worried. Joseph believed that he was nearly freezing to death, which he nearly was, and Seven had to let Joseph's beliefs predominate. "I'm dying," Joseph moaned. "No feeling at all in my legs. I'll never see my firstborn, my son, who will grow up to be a fine gentleman." Seven... Okay. Seven was... Okay. Seven was more upset than he wanted to admit. Suppose the rescue party didn't arrive in time. There was one thing he could do, beliefs or no, he thought. "Close your mental eyes," he said to Joseph, "and you're going to have a daughter. That is, you are if everything works out the way it's supposed to." "I am delirious," Joseph cried. "I decided I wanted a son in any case. You and Bianca decided on a girl, and we're not going to argue about it out here in the snow," Seven cried. "You're drunk, besides." "I don't want a boy or a girl," Joseph sighed, filled with self-pity. "I want to be single." "Close your mental eyes and keep quiet," Seven ordered. "Not on your life," Joseph protested. "I still don't know if I'm awake or dreaming." Seven said calmly, "Look, you always get upset when you come across something you don't understand. So kindly close your eyes for your own benefit." Joseph's mental eyes were terrified. "I don't know if I'm more afraid of freezing to death or of your help," he moaned. "You haven't time to wonder about it," Seven said, and in a flash he transported Joseph's physical body, mental body, and all, some 3 miles further down the hill, to a good spot where Elgren and his men with their horses and sleigh would find him quicker and easier. Joseph was screaming, "I'm dead! For God's sake! I'm flying through the air!" carried away by demons. At the same time, almost slyly, he kept poking his mental body in the ribs, seeing that he was, after all, quite alive. His dream or mental body had separated from his physical one, though, and suddenly Joseph stared, literally beside himself, to see his rumpled, nearly blue, stiff, sodden, and drunken form, eyelids stuck shut, with frost climbing between the thick, dark eyebrows, proud brown mustache looking like the ancient white quills of some senile porcupine. He was struck by a sudden longing for his body, with which he'd made love to Bianca and planted his seed. His bristly, usually vigorous thighs, splendid arms, paint-stained fingers. And he'd vowed that if he ever got out of this, he'd never complain again. He'd paint masterpieces and be a good husband and father and householder beside. OverSoul 7 got embarrassed whenever Joseph really allowed himself to feel his emotions, as opposed to playing with them as he usually did. What would happen if Joseph actually allowed himself to, well, honestly experience his feelings, instead of playing the mad artist or buffoon? Easy sentimentality was one thing, and Joseph moaned often, loudly, quarrelsomely, bombastically. But these present feelings went deeper. Joseph's sudden compassion for his body, in contrast to his usual self-pity, led 7 to say gently, "Your body will be all right. If you believe me, it will be found in time. It won't be damaged to any important degree." Lots of editing. Okay. Joseph was still staring at it, but the easily manufactured self-pity came back. "It'll freeze, poor thing," he sobbed. "It just might," 7 cried, exasperated. "Now listen. I have to get your thoughts off your body somehow. Just forget it, will you?" "Forget it?" Joseph screamed, nearly out of his wits by now. Nothing, 7 saw, would take Joseph's attention away from his body while he could still see it. And it wasn't in any shape for him to get back into. "Dear gods above," Joseph cried dramatically, and OverSoul 7 thought, "What a brilliant idea! It just might work." "Look over there," he told Joseph. Joseph turned, and with his attention momentarily off his body, 7 was able to whisk him away from it. Joseph felt a sudden dizziness. The snow grew dazzlingly brilliant all around him. Despite the darkness of the moment before, the ledge above him trembled and shifted in some indescribable fashion as he stared at it, and before him stretched a Sumeri path. The air was so warm and lovely in contrast to the earlier iciness that Joseph cried out with delight and relief. So did 7, because Joseph's concentration on warmth would help keep his physical body from freezing. That is, it would as long as 7 could keep Joseph occupied. "Where are we?" Joseph demanded. "How did we get here?" He spoke so quickly that he nearly stuttered because he looked down at his mental body, thinking it was his physical one, to see fine sun-bronzed limbs, small beads of perspiration running between the merry thigh hairs, as his legs flashed in and out of brown walking robe. And look, there's someone else, he shouted. It was Lydia, still looking like Joan of Arc, only somewhat wearier than before. She gasped when she saw Joseph. "What are you doing here?" "I don't even know where here is," Joseph said agreeably. "And I don't know you either." Then perplexed, "Or do I?" Lydia looked at Seven incredulously. "He doesn't remember who I am?" she asked Seven. "No, and I'd rather you didn't remind him right now," Seven replied quickly. "I have some excellent and important reasons." "What are they?" Lydia interrupted. "I really do believe in honesty above all, and as a soul, I don't know if you have the right to hide important information from Joseph." Lydia made a fascinating picture, and Joseph was staring at her with open admiration. He was in excellent spirits now, completely involved in this new adventure, his miseries and danger forgotten, and Seven wanted to keep it that way for a while. But Lydia indignantly put down the sword that went with her outfit and said, "I really think you owe Joseph an explanation." "That's the spirit," Joseph cried. "You tell him. He always intimidates me. I just see him when I'm drunk or dreaming, and right now I'm not sure of anything." Lydia frowned. "I know one thing," she said. "I'm sick of looking like Joan of Arc, and I'm tired of changing images all the time. I'd like to stick to one image and one environment. Why can't we camp here for the night and explore the land of the gods tomorrow? If it is the land of the gods." She was tired and peevish, and Seven sighed. The environment about them darkened. The sun was sinking. Purple shadows filled a nearby meadow of flowers. And just then, above on the hillside, the lights splashed on in all of the palaces and shone from the balconies. Joseph stared. He'd never seen so many lights in his life. Lydia laughed out loud. "The street lights of the gods!" She sobered instantly. "The gods don't really live on any mountain, or anywhere else, for that matter. I know that. I must have picked up the whole idea from mythology." She was her 20-year-old self now, nervously smoking a cigarette, and critical. She eyed Joseph. "You're real enough. I've met you before, even though you've forgotten. And OverSoul 7 is real, even though I used to think he wasn't." "Now look here. Of course I'm real," Joseph shouted. "And I'm almost seem to remember you. But what are you doing here? I must be dreaming. Are you—" "We're on a pilgrimage to find the gods, if there really are any," Lydia announced dramatically, half sarcastically, staring at OverSoul 7, yet unable to keep a certain wavering hope from her voice. "Anyhow, you seem to have joined us," she added, "and that's all I can tell you." Joseph scowled. "I'm not religious, and I think that priests are mostly rascals. But there's only one God. Talking about gods is blasphemy," he said, honestly outraged, forgetting his own earlier thoughts on the matter. He stared accusingly at Seven. "I knew it," he moaned dejectedly. "Why can't I have an ordinary soul like anyone else? One that I can count on, instead of some renegade kind that sets out on pagan pilgrimages." But as soon as he spoke, Joseph stopped, considering. Everything that he'd ever heard about pagan gods rushed into his mind. Orgies! He remembered the Norse deities again, and almost smelled the meat roasting on spits, thick grease sizzling. Damn, he was hungry. The central richness overwhelmed him and spread out his tantalizing aura so that Lydia cried. "Something really smells great." "Roast pig," Joseph shouted. "A feast of such gigantic proportions." "He's delirious," Elgrim Hosensov muttered. "Roast pig indeed." He and his two brothers knelt by Joseph's body and tried to bundle it up into the sleigh. It was well below zero. The men felt nearly frozen themselves. "Wake up, Joseph! You have to move around. Wake up!" Elgrin shouted in Joseph's ear. He and his brothers grabbed Joseph's arms and started jerking them up and down, then his legs. Elgrin opened the stiff mouth and slobberily poured some brandy down Joseph's throat. Joseph gagged, sputtered, coughed, and opened his physical eyes. Instead of the summer night, he saw the snow and the close-up of Elgrin's anxious face. Large pores with blackheads, some half hidden at the edges of the red woolen scarf. But most of all, Joseph saw Elgrin's furious yet frightened, cold, swollen eyes. "Oh God!" Elgrin was yelling, caught between calling Joseph a blockhead and crying with gratitude as Joseph's bleary eyes opened. "He's come to!" Elgrin shouted. "Give me a hand!" They all loaded Joseph on the sleigh, while Elgrin sat beside him, constantly moving his arms and legs, forcing him to move, much against his own inclination. "Let me sleep," Joseph kept muttering. "Just let me sleep." "Severe frostbite, at the very least," Elgrin muttered. "The damn fool running off like that, with his wife about to bear." At the same time, he and the others found that their moods were lifting. They had needed relief from the house and barns. The excitement of the rescue and its success would make them heroes on their return. Still, Elgrin was anxious. He urged the horses on. Joseph had been out in the cold far too long. He frowned, cursed under his breath, and kept rubbing Joseph's hands while sipping brandy to keep himself warm. Now and then he forced some more down Joseph's throat. The brandy, Joseph thought, was excellent. "Where did you get this?" He held up a heavy mug and grinned. "It's fit for the gods," he said. While OverSoul 7 looked on anxiously, Joseph shrugged. "I thought I felt a cold draught of air, and this really warms me up. But how could I have felt a chill? The air is warm as summer." Just your imagination, Seven said. I almost heard voices too, Joseph said. Some brandy trickled down his fine brown mustache. He wiped it off with his hand. Do you hear voices? He asked. It's just the breeze, Seven said quickly. He didn't want Joseph to return to his body again until it was thawed out. Yet even he could hear Hosenthoff's raucous shouts, the horse's gallop, horseshoes now and then breaking through the crusted snow, one horse 4 hoofs sore. Seven caught himself just in time and closed out the images before he landed all 3 of them back there with the Hosenthoff sleigh. Lydia, now in blouse and slacks, sat down dejectedly. I was so excited at first, seeing these mountains. I thought of Mount Olympus. But most likely there's really nothing real up there. Yet why is that scene so tantalizing? She stared. The warm, bright lights splashed down the summer night hills. Those are Olympian hills, she said moodily. My God, the universe is vast. She felt as if she were going to cry. Don't worry about it, Joseph replied. All this has to be a dream to begin with. The soft wind enveloped him. He felt full of vigor, and he eyed Lydia with more than just a touch of appreciation. Let's go sit down beneath those trees, he said, his mustache quivering with his sudden gleeful duplicity. Lydia understood his intent at once. She almost yelled, You can't act like that. I'm going to be born as your daughter. But OverSoul 7 mentally stopped her. He didn't want Joseph reminded of Bianca or his body until the physical situation was stabilized. Like Joseph, the Hosenthoffs often exaggerated the most simple events of their lives, and Seven knew that despite her moans and groans at the farmhouse, Bianca wasn't really in labor yet. Checking, Seven mentally monitored Joseph's half-frozen body as it sat slumped in the sleigh, and frowned. Joseph could just possibly lose a leg. For a moment, OverSoul 7 felt really disconsolate. He had more trouble than he needed, and what he really needed was a good brisk wind behind the sleigh and horses. The horses themselves were tiring. What he really needed was... Seven broke off. Suddenly, the Denmark scene became brilliantly clear. A strong wind came sweeping down behind the sleigh, pushing it so fast that Elgren Hosenthoff yelled, Where the devil did that wind come from? And in a near kind of distance, OverSoul 7 heard Cypress say to him, That's the help you needed. And don't forget your practice teaching dream class. I had forgotten it, Seven cried mentally. But Cypress' presence vanished. Joseph was saying, I know what I'd like to do, and leering at Lydia. Can't you do something with him? She asked Seven impatiently. Her black hair gently tangled in the wind. She swept the loose locks back uneasily, wondering if she felt any desire for Joseph. There was warm moisture around his brown eyes and broad forehead. His glance was certainly inviting, but she couldn't forget that she would be his daughter. Maybe, anyway. But more than that, she kept relating to him from a viewpoint of a whole lifetime of different ages. If she stayed at 20, then Joseph was an interesting older man, gallant, and almost sophisticated. But then mentally she sprang to 35, and from there he seemed amusingly inept and bumbling. She was quite lost in these thoughts, perplexed and near harried, while Joseph sat down on a ledge, crossed his legs, and gave her what he considered his deadliest, most suggestive leer. Mentally, OverSoul 7 heard an invisible cypress say, "Look at the mountain." Her presence vanished again before he could comment, and 7 stared at the mountain as directed. It hadn't changed. Or did he now notice vague figures at one of the distant castle windows? "Good Zeus! Woman, make up your mind," Joseph thundered at Lydia. In Chapter 6. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.